My name is Richard Bronk. I have a background in practical decision making, and in the academic study of decision making and uncertainty. I was a fund manager for many years before joining the Bank of England as a policymaker, and then the LSE in 2000. And as David kindly mentioned, I've just done this book with Jens Beckert, Uncertain Futures. Now, before I introduce our two speakers and Ekaterina beside me, David encouraged me to take 2 or 3 minutes to say a few provocative things to underline the points made earlier about the nature of the uncertainty we're dealing with here. And as Tobias has just underlined really crucially, it's quite different, the uncertainty from measurable risk. But equally important, I think, is to say that the uncertainty that concerns us in this session, and maybe in this conference as a whole, is quite different from the information problems and cognitive biases studied by the information and behavioural traditions in standard economics. In other words, we're not talking about the predictable and potentially correctable framing biases or information asymmetries that lend themselves to bolt-on amendments to standard rational expectations and rational choice models. Indeed, we're not really talking about the epistemological shortcomings of rational agents per se. Instead, what we're focusing on is the underlying radical indeterminacy in dynamic capitalist economies and markets, characterized by relentless innovation and complex interdependence, and how agents then cope with that indeterminacy. And it was, as Joseph Schumpeter argued, the competition that counts in dynamic economies and financial markets is from the new product, the new process, the new type of organization. And such innovations and novelties imply a radical break between the past and the future. They break the predictable links between the past and the future and ensure that the future is not a statistical shadow of the past. And what is more, this first order uncertainty implied by any particular innovation is then compounded by uncertainty about the second order creative reactions of others and by the contingency of their interpretations of that unfolding reality. Add to this then the non-linear reactions to the crossing of thresholds and tipping points in complex economic systems and the prevalence of emergent disequilibrium, and the future appears to be radically indeterminate. And that's before you consider the unpredictable political reactions to economic trends. Political upsets, as we've been reminded in the last 3 years, are a major source of economic uncertainty. And I don't think they should really be seen as entirely exogenous to the economic system. For when you think about it, there's something inherently political about an economy where the future is uncertain. When expectations cannot be anchored in pre-existing objective probability functions, because the future has not yet been created, then the beliefs and heuristics governing our behaviour may be a function of market, political, or even rhetorical power. Because expectations influence rather than simply reflect the future, they are the valid object of political and market competition. So if agents cannot rationally converge on the correct heuristic or model of the future, because it's impossible to know ex ante what the best model or heuristic will be, then how do they form their expectations and decide how to act? How do they coordinate their beliefs and actions with others when the expectations of relevant actors have no anchor in objective probability functions? Are there heuristics or ways of using heuristics that reflect adaptation not merely to past trends or shocks, but more importantly to the relentless need to navigate the ongoing indeterminacy of dynamic economies? How do we use communication to convince ourselves and others that our chosen imaginaries, narratives and heuristics should be internalized by others so as to perform the future and create a world in their own image? And how do we do that while remaining constantly alert to the danger that our models and heuristics may be wrong? How do we stabilize expectations and coordinate with others while remaining open to skepticism and open-minded doubt, the open-minded doubt necessary to spot unexpected novelties? Just because the world is uncertain, of course, does not mean we can have no clue about the future. So how do we combine calculation and knowledge of stable constraints and causal mechanisms with heuristics, with imaginaries, and with constant trial and error and learn? Well, I'm pretty sure that we're going to get some fascinating answers to these questions from the two talks now. So let me introduce first our two speakers. Ekaterina Svetlova, Associate Professor of Accounting and Finance at the University of Leicester. An economic sociologist, she has a particular interest in the philosophy of science and the role of financial models, and her new book, which I highly recommend, Financial Models and Society, is published by Edward Elgar. And then Timo Erik, who will speak after Ekaterina, is Assistant Professor in the Strategic Organization and Design Group and the Max Planck Institute for Mathematics and the Sciences in Leipzig. And his research focuses on bringing realistic assumptions about knowledge, emotion, and belief into models of human interaction. And after their presentations, Peter Shalanov from the University of Exeter will act as discussant.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. What I'm going to do today is to present my first findings and first thoughts from my project that was financed by the CRUISSE sister network, M2D, Models to Decisions, and address one of the three central themes of this network, namely communicating uncertainty. In the talk, I will start with explaining why uncertainty communication to investors in financial markets is the real-world high-impact problem. And then I will briefly present empirical materials that I collected during the project, and will present one specific small case. Namely, I will explain how Brexit uncertainty has been communicated by companies, by FTSE 100 companies so far. And we'll conclude with some suggestions for research and practice of uncertainty communication in markets. So first, the problem. What is the problem at all? So we know that all listed companies, companies that are publicly traded at the stock exchange, are obliged to communicate the potential threats to their business to capital markets. Right? People in capital markets make decisions whether to stay with investment in this particular company or to withdraw money. If this communication fails, then those guys here might make wrong decisions, might misallocate the capital, in the individual capital, or it could lead to misallocation of the capital in an economy as a whole. So this is a severe problem. Usually communication of risks happens in financial markets in the framework of so-called risk disclosure in annual reports, in the principal risks section of annual reports. This framework has been criticized for ages now. Preparers and users of this information has been dissatisfied with how it goes, because basically the information that is provided in principal risk sections of annual reports is considered to be too broad and too generic. Basically, if you open the annual report, you will see a long list of various risks to which companies are exposed. And you have all kinds of risks there. You will find Brexit there, maybe, not by all companies. You will find supply chain risks, competition. So it's just a list with some suggestions how to mitigate those risks. This kind of risk disclosure has been perceived by users for years as really formal box-ticking exercise that doesn't deliver enough information to investors how to reallocate money. So the problem is kind of severe, but the question is also why has this practice not really changed so far. So what we observed is that companies started to provide more information. So information in annual reports really inflated in terms of quantity, but there was no improvement in terms of quality. So my question is why there was no real change, because obviously people in capital markets investors, they have the power to influence how information is provided to them because they have money, invest money. Right, so my approach to the problem was to do some empirical research, to do observational studies, qualitative studies. So I conducted some semi-structured interviews with capital market participants, but also with preparers of risk information, in particular investor relations. Also, I participated in some investor relations events. For example, investor relations best practice workshop in London, and to my big surprise, in one day, whole day event, the word uncertainty has not been mentioned once. I also looked in some written documents, annual reports, obviously, also transcripts and webcasts of the quarterly and annual earnings conference with investors. Also, I compiled a database on Brexit reporting. So I went to annual reports of all 100 companies and copied the sections where they explain what Brexit as a risk is to them. And also I had some informal conversations with companies who are involved in business communication, for example, Invecom in the city, and also most important conversation was with a financial reporting council. They have financial reporting lab that is focusing on risk reporting now, and they were very supportive for the project, and so we had some interesting discussions. But before I move to my empirical findings, I really would like to to make one step back and set the theoretical framework in which we move. All right. So in the introductory lecture by David, so we heard that there were kind of two intellectual movements that are opposite or move in opposite directions, right? So on the one hand, we have this translation of uncertainty into risk movement based on probability tools described in again the Gott's book or Organized Uncertainty by Michael Power as a risk management movement, right? So it is about how uncertainties were translated, could be translated into calculable, manageable, and accountable risks, right? On the other hand, based on research findings, ideas of Knight, Keynes, and Shako, Richard and Jens, for example, recently published the volume that suggests exactly what Richard just described, that we cannot perfectly know the future because it is unfolding. So companies find themselves in the situation of radical uncertainty, and no innovation is possible without it. Right, however, for me, sometimes it sounds like a fight between risk people against uncertainty people, and I just maybe would not subscribe to this view because so I rather ask with Pat O'Malley how techniques of risk do interplay with techniques of uncertainty. And my point would be to say that there is no particular situations where we say clearly, okay, this is a situation of risk, or this is a situation of uncertainty. Because as I will show in my presentation, sometimes uncertainty over time might be translated or transformed into risks, and risks might become uncertainties. And the importance of uncertainty in a particular situation can be relativized in situ of markets, in how social actors, social agents act, and how they treat and interpret the situation. And this social setting in which uncertainty communication happens is indeed very, very important. So we talked a lot today about to model or not to model, so that's the question. Actually, this whole modeling and communication of uncertainty really happens in a particular social settings that we should understand. And so I really like the idea that was suggested by Mauritsen and Kreiner in one paper in Accounting Organization in Society Journal, the idea of promissory economy. So basically, when a company makes a decision, for example, to develop a new product, or a new medicine, for example, of course this decision is a kind of an action. At the same time, this decision is a commitment that reaches out into the future. It is a promise to investors to do particular things. At the same time, as I said, companies have to communicate the threats to this promise. And this is a very difficult balance because they should not scare investors, but at the same time they have to be transparent. And the problem is that this future here is indeed unknown because as time passes, this future is developing, it's coming into being, and companies, what they have to do is they have to maintain this regime of hope. They have to support the hope in investors, and by talking about something they really don't know. Right? So what they do is basically what the philosopher Frankfurter described as bullshitting, because it is, I think, the best definition of uncertain communication in markets. You really have to meaningfully communicate something you don't know. This communication, it's not meant negatively, right? Because it is not impression management to which we are used as description of communication in financial markets, like companies are hiding information or are misleading investors, and it can lead to disasters, like in case of Enron. Right? So this is something completely different. Companies really don't know what will happen. They might guess what might happen, and there are different regimes of bullshitting. For example, forecasting or making exact predictions is one of such regimes. Translating uncertainties into risks is one possible regime, but also we simply do not know communication is also one possible option here. To communicate about the future. Right? And of course there is always an ongoing backward justification of legitimization of decisions. Right? And so keeping that in mind, we could see how companies have communicated Brexit uncertainty so far in the annual reports. And so by going through this reporting, first thing that I found out is that in all reports that address the Brexit as a threat to the business, they used clearly uncertainty as a term. So it is a part of principal risks section. Nobody said Brexit is a risk, it is uncertainty. And it was really refreshing because it merely they really quoted Keynes. We simply do not know. It's what they wrote, and it was really good. And but then paradoxically, all companies moved to this risk management modus, and they wrote about planning for uncertainty. And there was this "we are on the top of things" rhetorics developed in various kinds, but you really could see the pattern. Nearly all companies do it the same way. There are maybe 2 or 3 companies outstanding with more detailed reporting, but most of companies said, okay, it is too early to be precise, so we cannot quantify anything because we don't know anything. But we are doing stuff. We establish committees and project groups that watch what is going on. We observe negotiations. We also develop contingency plans and calculate scenarios. But those scenarios calculating results are not communicated in any way in any reports. And importantly, not one company said we are going to change our business model. Right? So it's business as usual. And companies that are really strong, have lobbying power, that they are working with government to influence government to move into their direction and take into account their interests. And basically from this kind of, so what my point is that from this kind of reporting of the risk, no investor could really make any useful conclusions to stay in this particular company or not to stay, to change opinion about the company or not. Right? And okay, you might say annual report is of course just one channel through which communication with markets happens. Investors with power, investors with money, always have an opportunity to ask the managers the questions that are really relevant to them. Right? For example, in earnings conferences. So I looked into transcriptions of earnings conferences, and basically in no one of those transcripts Brexit was mentioned. So investors do not ask questions about Brexit. And so one can say that kind of this type of uncertainty is really excluded from communication by mutual agreement in markets as irrelevant. And I think this is interesting because obviously it cannot be that Brexit will not influence severely any company in the UK. And for me, it is just a big elephant in the room. And especially because 2 days ago I switched on Bloomberg TV and they reported that Steve Eisman, who was featured in Big Short movie, said that he is shorting now 2 UK banks because of Brexit, and he has 50 companies on the screen. And the moderator asked, guys, why does no one talk about Brexit? And it's an interesting question, because obviously this is an issue. But so I thought about it, how to explain it, and also keeping in mind other empirical findings in the project. And I came up with a graphical explanation. And particularly, I think it is important to take in mind one issue, namely time. So when we discuss about we discuss risk or we discuss uncertainty, very often we do not discuss how they change when time passes. But indeed, time plays a role, because the knowledge of companies, the level of knowledge, or the level, or the extent at which companies can quantify particular issues might change when time passes. Right? So uncertainties might be transformed into risks, and maybe risks might be transformed into uncertainties with time. So one example is Brexit. Right? So Brexit in June 2016, as uncertainty feels somehow different than Brexit in March 2018. Maybe we will know more here, maybe not, but somehow here we still move on time till here, and companies kind of don't feel not to know enough to meaningfully explain what the consequences of Brexit are. The other example is from pharma. I talked to investor relations in pharma companies, and they said that investors basically are not inclined to discuss with them any new medicine in preclinical testing here or clinical trials in phase 1. Sometimes they discuss phase 2, but what they really want to discuss is just phase 3 trial and licensing approval, how it's going on. Because here you have better quantification and you have better understanding of the influence of this new medicine on the cash flow. Right? So what we find out, I think, is that there is kind of relevance threshold before which uncertainty is kind of irrelevant or is made irrelevant by social agents involved in the communication. And if time passes and this threshold is passed and the issue becomes really relevant, then everybody starts to talk about it, right? This, how it happens, when it happens, is, I think, a big issue, but it's unclear. So it's not just about how convincing a particular narrative is, but when it becomes relevant. This research, I think, opens up some questions, which I just will present and finish my presentation. So one important issue, I think, is the work on definitions. So in accounting and particularly sometimes in finance as well, there is a call to clarify what risk is and what uncertainty is. And it has not been done, right? So we have this definition risk as the situation when we know probabilities and all outcomes, but there are different types of uncertainties. There is imprecision, ambiguity, interdeterminacy, unawareness. What do exactly companies mean when they say Brexit is uncertainty for them? What exactly do companies mean if they say this is a risk? And what exactly do investors mean by risks and uncertainties? And I think here is a lot of empirical work needed to understand whether they speak the same language at all. And Brexit and climate change uncertainties feel differently than supply chain risk, right? Maybe this work on definitions would also allow companies to present uncertainties, risks, not in just one general list, but to differentiate them in how they present them. Also, as I said, I think it's, we need better understanding on when and how risk or uncertainty narratives become relevant. Where is this threshold? How one narrative is, how uncertainty suddenly becomes a risk about everybody can talk, how uncertainties are excluded or included in the conversation. The other important issue, how to communicate possible high impact events, right? Because on the one hand you might say, okay, just communicate to us what those events might be. But if every eventuality would be calculated by a company, would investors really consider this information as relevant? Would they really like to know everything that might happen? In case of British Petroleum, for example, with the Deep Horizon platform, the company mentioned safety risk all the time. So it was kind of communicated, it was mentioned. But this just mentioning safety risk didn't provide investors with any information how severe this risk is and which financial consequences it will have. Right? So this is not a trivial issue, and there is a lot of things to be done. Also, the issue of internal scenario analysis. In Brexit reporting, companies mention and say calculate things internally, and I'm sure they do. But if we really want transparency, these calculations should be made transparent to markets. On the other hand, a company always say this is sensitive information. Investors are not convinced. So to which extent should companies disclose their internal scenario analysis? I think if we really want transparent markets, and it's consequently transparent markets, those scenarios, at least partly, should be made available to investors. Visualization is a huge issue. A lot of things can be done here. So far, we had only risk matrix in form of traffic lights or heat maps that nearly all the time include likelihood or probabilities. But if we are really talking about communication of critical uncertainties, this type of visualization might not work. So what should be in place instead of risk matrix? In my view is that strength of knowledge, or strength of invaluable knowledge might be included in this visualization, but there is also a whole field to be a lot to be done. And finally, maybe we should develop the quality criteria for uncertainty communication, because there is a lot have been done about quality of uncertainty communication in science. Could we use quality criteria that are used in science? Could we apply them to uncertainty communication in markets? So that's the question. And so I think the whole project, just first writing up of the results, shows that there is a lot. This is a big problem with a lot of unresolved questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Ekaterina. Fascinating.